The leather chair felt cold against Margaret Chen's back as she sat in her grandfather's lawyer's office, surrounded by mahogany panels and the smell of old books. She'd been dreading this moment for 2 weeks, ever since they'd lowered William Chen's casket into the ground. The will reading, the final goodbye, the moment when everything her grandfather had built would be passed on to the next generation. She was the only family he had left, or at least she thought she was. The door burst open with such force that the hinges rattled. Margaret's head snapped up, and her breath caught in her throat. There, standing in the doorway, was her husband James. But he wasn't alone. In his arms, he held a 6-month-old baby with a tuft of dark hair and James's distinctive brown eyes. And beside him, wearing a tight black dress and a smile that could only be described as triumphant, was Vanessa Blake, the woman Margaret had met exactly once at her grandfather's funeral. "I'm sorry I'm late," James said, his voice casual, as if he hadn't just walked into a private family meeting carrying living, breathing evidence of his betrayal. Traffic was terrible. Margaret couldn't speak. Her throat had closed. Her hands were gripping the armrests so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the lawyer, Robert Chen, stammering something about authorized attendees and family-only proceedings. But all Margaret could see was that baby. That beautiful, innocent baby whose mere existence meant that everything she'd believed about her marriage, about her life, about the man she'd loved for 8 years, was a lie. "Who are these people?" Robert demanded, standing up from behind his massive desk. James adjusted the baby in his arms and met Margaret's eyes with something that looked almost like defiance. "I'm her husband," he said clearly, "and this is my son." The room tilted. Margaret heard someone make a small, wounded sound, and realized with horror that it had come from her own throat. But this wasn't how the story began. To understand how Margaret Chen ended up in that moment, watching her world implode in a lawyer's office while a room full of strangers bore witness to her humiliation, we need to go back. Back to 3 months earlier, when Margaret's life still made sense. Margaret had always been the responsible one, the good granddaughter, the dedicated wife, the brilliant architect who'd sacrificed sleep and social life to climb to the top of her profession. At 34, she was a senior architect at Morrison & Associates, one of the most prestigious firms in the city, earning just over $400,000 a year. She lived in a penthouse apartment in the financial district, wore designer clothes to work every day, and had a marriage that everyone called goals. James Peterson had swept into her life 8 years ago at a gallery opening. He was charming, successful, and came from old money. He worked as a real estate developer, closing deals that made headlines and throwing parties that made the society pages. He was the kind of man who knew how to work a room, who could make you feel like you were the only person in the world when he turned his attention to you. Margaret's grandfather had never liked him. William Chen was a self-made billionaire who'd built Chen Industries from nothing, starting with a single textile factory and growing it into a manufacturing empire worth over $800 million. He'd survived poverty, discrimination, and more business rivals than he could count. He had an instinct for people, for knowing who wanted something from you and who genuinely cared. "That man looks at you like you're a bank account," William had told Margaret 2 years into her marriage. Margaret had laughed it off. "Gong gong, James has his own money. He doesn't need mine." But William had just shaken his head, his weathered face sad. "Everyone needs money, Bao Bei. The question is what they're willing to do to get it." Margaret wished she'd listened. When William was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, Margaret had taken a leave of absence from work to care for him. She spent 18-hour days at the hospital, holding his hand, reading to him, making sure he wasn't in pain. James had been supportive, or so she'd thought. He visited the hospital daily, bringing flowers and sitting with William when Margaret needed to step out for air. She'd noticed he was on his phone constantly, always stepping into the hallway to take calls. "Work emergencies," he'd explained. "You know how it is. The market doesn't stop just because we're dealing with personal tragedy." Margaret had accepted this explanation because she was drowning in grief and exhaustion, and because she trusted him. Because after 8 years of marriage, you're supposed to trust your husband. William died on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was coming up. Margaret was holding his hand when he took his last breath. His final words to her were, "You're the only one who never wanted my money, Bao Bei. Don't let bitterness consume you like it consumed me." She hadn't understood what he meant then. She would later. The funeral was massive. Over 500 people attended, business associates and competitors alike, society figures and distant relatives who hadn't spoken to William in decades but showed up to pay respects to his fortune. Margaret moved through it all in a fog, shaking hands, accepting condolences, trying to be the gracious granddaughter everyone expected her to be. That's when she first really noticed Vanessa. The woman was young, maybe 28, with long blonde hair and the kind of figure that came from expensive personal training. She'd introduced herself as a business associate of James's, someone helping with a major commercial real estate deal. But there was something in the way she touched James's arm, the way her eyes followed him around the room, that made Margaret's instincts scream. Her best friend Rebecca had noticed it too. "That woman is looking at him like she owns him," Rebecca whispered as they stood by the buffet table. "She's just a colleague," Margaret had replied, but even as she said it, she felt a cold weight settling in her stomach. The discovery came 3 days after the funeral. Margaret had returned home early from meeting with the funeral director about final arrangements. She'd walked into the guest bathroom to wash her hands and seen it sitting on top of the trash can, not even buried beneath tissues or hidden. Pregnancy test. Positive. Margaret had stared at that little plastic stick for a full minute, her mind trying to make sense of it. They didn't have guests. She wasn't pregnant, which meant, "Margaret, you're home early." She turned to find James standing in the bathroom doorway, his face going from surprise to pale to something that looked almost like relief, all in the space of 3 seconds. "Whose is this?" She'd held up the test with a hand that wasn't shaking yet, but would be soon. James had actually sighed. "I was going to tell you, after the funeral arrangements were finished. I didn't want to add to your pain." "How considerate of you," Margaret heard herself say, and her voice sounded strange, distant, like it was coming from underwater. "How long?" 18 months. 18 months. A year and a half. While Margaret had been working 60-hour weeks, while she'd been caring for her dying grandfather, while she'd been planning their future, James had been building a separate life with another woman. "Her name is Vanessa Blake," James continued, and Margaret wanted to scream at him to stop talking, but her voice had abandoned her entirely. "She's pregnant, about 6 months along. I didn't plan for this to happen, Margaret. I love you, but I have feelings for her. And there's a baby now. My son. Get out. Margaret, we need to talk about this. Get out." The scream had torn from her throat, raw and primal. "Get out of my house. Get out of my life. Get out." James had left. He'd packed a bag, called a car, and moved in with Vanessa that same night. Just like that, 8 years of marriage ended with a suitcase and a closing door. Margaret hadn't eaten for 3 days after that. She'd lost 8 pounds, unable to keep food down, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but lie on her bedroom floor and stare at the ceiling, trying to understand how her entire life had fallen apart in the space of 2 weeks. Rebecca had practically moved in, forcing Margaret to shower, to drink water, to put on clean clothes. "You're going to get through this," Rebecca kept saying. "You're stronger than you know." But Margaret didn't feel strong. She felt hollowed out, empty, like someone had reached inside her chest and removed everything vital. The will reading was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral. Standard procedure, Robert had explained. Time for distant relatives to make arrangements, for the estate to be properly assessed, for all the legal documents to be prepared and reviewed. Margaret had met with Robert privately a few days before the official reading. He was a distant cousin on her father's side, a sharp-eyed man in his 50s who'd been William's lawyer for over 20 years. "Your grandfather was a very shrewd man," Robert had told her, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "This will is unconventional, but everything he did was for a reason." Margaret had assumed she was inheriting the company. She was William's only grandchild, his only direct descendant. Who else would he leave it to? "I don't want James at the reading," she told Robert. He has no right to be there. Robert had made a note. I'll make sure security is informed. Which brought us back to that moment. That terrible, impossible moment when James walked through the door carrying proof of his betrayal, and Margaret's carefully controlled composure shattered into 1,000 pieces. You can't be here, Margaret said, finding her voice finally. Came out stronger than she'd expected, cold and sharp as a blade. This is family only. I was married to you when William died, James replied, and Margaret noticed that he'd positioned himself strategically, holding the baby like a shield. That makes me family. And this is William's great-grandson. Doesn't he have a right to be here? Vanessa's smile widened. She was enjoying this, Margaret realized with a jolt of pure rage. This woman was standing in her grandfather's lawyer's office, watching Margaret's humiliation, and she was enjoying every second of it. Actually, Mr. Peterson, Robert interrupted, his voice carefully neutral, you may want to hear this. The room fell silent. There were 12 people present, board members from Chun Industries, distant relatives Margaret barely knew, longtime employees of her grandfather's. All of them were staring, witnessing her private tragedy become public spectacle. Robert cleared his throat and began to read. The first part was standard. Bonuses for longtime staff, generous donations to various charities, small bequests to distant relatives. Margaret barely heard it. She was watching James, the way his eyes kept darting around the room, calculating, always calculating. Then Robert's voice changed, becoming more formal. To my beloved granddaughter Margaret Chun, I leave my entire estate, including Chun Industries, all properties, and liquid assets totaling $847 million. The room erupted. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered something that sounded like, "My God." Margaret felt the words wash over her without quite comprehending them. $847 million. Her grandfather had been wealthy, yes, but she'd never known the exact figure. Never wanted to know. She looked at James. His face had gone through a remarkable transformation, from shock to calculation to something that looked almost like hope. And she knew, in that moment, exactly what he was thinking. Community property. Marital assets. He was still her husband, technically, which meant, however, Robert continued, and the room fell silent again. There are conditions. Margaret's attention snapped back to the lawyer. Conditions? Condition 1. Margaret must remain CEO of Chun Industries for a minimum of 5 years. If she leaves or sells the company before that time, the entire estate will be donated to charity. That made sense. Her grandfather had built Chun Industries from nothing. He wouldn't want it dismantled or sold off in pieces. Condition 2. If Margaret divorces within 2 years of my death, her spouse at the time of divorce will receive 40% of the estate. Margaret's blood went cold. Condition 3. If Margaret remains married for the full 2 years, her spouse receives nothing, and she retains complete control of the entire estate. The silence in the room was absolute. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, could feel every eye in the room on her face. But she was watching James, and what she saw there made her stomach turn. His face had transformed again. The shock was gone, replaced by something calculating and hungry. He wasn't looking at her with guilt or remorse or even residual love. He was looking at her like she was a puzzle he needed to solve, an obstacle between him and $338 million. Margaret, he said, and his voice had that warm, persuasive quality that had first attracted her to him 8 years ago. We need to talk. Privately. She should have said no. Should have had security throw him out, should have ended it right there. But some part of her, the part that had loved him for 8 years, the part that still couldn't quite believe this was happening, needed to hear what he would say. They stepped into the hallway. James was still holding the baby, who had started to fuss. Small whimpering sounds that made Margaret's heart clench despite everything. I made a terrible mistake, James began, and Margaret had to resist the urge to laugh hysterically. The affair, Vanessa, all of it. I was confused, scared of the commitment, scared of really settling down. But I love you, Margaret. I choose you. I've always chosen you. You're holding your infant son while you're saying this, Margaret said flatly. James glanced down at the baby like he'd forgotten it was there. He's a mistake. A beautiful mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. You are my wife. We took vows. For better or worse. Remember? We can work through this. We can go to counseling. Rebuild our trust. Start fresh. Start fresh with $338 million. The words hung in the air between them. James had the grace to look uncomfortable, shifting the baby from one arm to the other. That's not what this is about, he said, but his eyes gave him away. Yes, the inheritance is significant, but that's not why I want to make our marriage work. I want to make it work because I love you, because 8 years means something, because... The door to the lawyer's office burst open and Vanessa stormed out, her face twisted with rage. She'd clearly been listening at the door, had heard every word of James's declaration. "You bastard!" she screamed, and the baby started crying in earnest now, wailing against James's shoulder. "You absolute bastard! I gave up my career for you. I got pregnant for you. I left my boyfriend for you. Vanessa, not here." James tried, but Vanessa was past caring. She turned to Margaret, her eyes blazing. "He promised me everything. He said he loved me, that he was going to leave you as soon as your grandfather died. He said we'd get married, raise our son together, be a real family. He used your grandfather's illness to hide our affair. Every single time he said he was visiting the hospital, he was with me. Every work emergency was him in my bed. And now that there's money involved, suddenly he loves you again." Margaret felt something shift inside her. The grief and shock that had been paralyzing her started to transform into something colder, harder, more focused. She looked at James, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for perhaps the first time in their entire marriage. He wasn't the man she'd thought she married. Maybe he'd never been that man. Maybe she'd built him up in her mind, created a fantasy husband because the real one had never quite measured up. "Get her out of here," James said to security, as if he had any authority in this building, in this situation in Margaret's life. 2 security guards appeared, gently but firmly escorting Vanessa toward the elevator. She was still screaming, threatening to sue, to tell everyone the truth, to make James pay. The baby's cries echoed down the hallway long after they'd disappeared. James turned back to Margaret, his expression imploring. "See? She's unstable. She's emotional and irrational, and she's going to make our lives hell. You're the only stable thing in my life, Margaret. You're rational, level-headed, reasonable. We can make this work. I know we can." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "I need time to think." Relief flooded James's face. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll be staying at the Fairmont downtown. Room 412. Call me when you're ready to talk more." He left, still carrying his crying son, and Margaret stood alone in the hallway of her grandfather's lawyer's office, surrounded by mahogany and old leather and the weight of $847 million. She returned to the office where everyone was still waiting, their faces a mixture of pity and curiosity, and in some cases, barely concealed glee at the drama they'd witnessed. Margaret held her head high, thanked Robert for his time, and walked out of that building with as much dignity as she could muster. Rebecca was waiting in the parking garage, having watched the whole scene unfold from a coffee shop across the street. She took one look at Margaret's face and said, "What are you going to do?" Margaret climbed into the passenger seat of Rebecca's car and said, with a calmness that surprised even herself, "I'm going to destroy him." "How?" Margaret smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "My grandfather didn't put that clause in the will for no reason. He knew. He always knew what James was." She remembered now, a conversation from 2 years ago that she'd dismissed at the time. William had been recovering from a minor surgery, slightly loopy from pain medication, and he'd grabbed Margaret's hand with surprising strength. "I'm having the will updated," he'd told her. "Adding protections. That man you married, he's going to show his true colors eventually. And when he does, I want you to have the power to make him regret it." Margaret had laughed it off, told her grandfather he was being paranoid, that James loved her for her, not for what she might inherit someday. William had just shaken his head. Love and money, Bao Bei. When they come together, you find out who people really are. Now, sitting in Rebecca's car, Margaret finally understood what her grandfather had done. He'd created the perfect trap. James could have 40% of the estate, but only if Margaret divorced him. If James divorced Margaret, he got nothing. If Margaret stayed married for 2 years, James got nothing. The only way James could get that money was if Margaret chose to give it to him by ending the marriage within the 2-year window. Her grandfather had put James in an impossible position. He could stay married to a woman who now knew he was a cheating, lying opportunist and hope she'd eventually forgive him enough to divorce him and split the money. Or he could leave with nothing. And Margaret? She held all the cards. She could divorce him immediately and he'd walk away with $338 million. Or she could make him suffer for 2 years, destroy him piece by piece, and then let him go with nothing. "I know what I'm going to do," Margaret said quietly. Rebecca looked at her friend's face and felt a small shiver of apprehension. The woman sitting next to her wasn't the heartbroken wife who'd been lying on her bedroom floor 3 days ago. This was someone new, someone harder, someone capable of things the old Margaret would never have considered. "What?" Rebecca asked. Margaret's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm going to save my marriage." That night, Margaret called James at his hotel. He answered on the first ring, his voice eager and hopeful. "Margaret, have you thought about what I said?" "I have," she replied, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "I want to try to make our marriage work." She could hear the relief in James's exhale, the triumph he was trying to hide. "Oh, baby, I knew you'd see reason. I knew you'd understand that what we have is worth fighting for." "But there are conditions," Margaret interrupted. Pause. "Conditions? If we're going to rebuild our marriage, we do it my way. I'm not going to be the naive wife who looks the other way anymore. So here are my terms, James. Accept them all, or this conversation is over and you can call your lawyer in the morning." She laid them out clearly, precisely, like the architect she was, building the framework of his destruction brick by brick. Rule 1. He would move back into the penthouse, but they would have separate bedrooms. No physical intimacy until trust was rebuilt, which she estimated would take at least 2 years. Rule 2. He would pay child support to Vanessa for his son, but he would have no contact with her beyond the financial. All communication would go through lawyers. Rule 3. They would attend marriage counseling twice a week. She'd already selected the therapist, a woman with a reputation for being tough but fair. Rule 4. He would quit his job at the real estate development firm and come work for Chan Industries under her direct supervision. She wanted him where she could see him, where she could watch him, where he couldn't hide anything from her. Rule 5. They would sign an amendment to their prenuptial agreement stating that if he cheated again, he would get nothing even if she divorced him. This clause would remain in effect for the full 2 years. James agreed to everything. He agreed so quickly, with so little pushback, that Margaret knew her instincts were correct. He didn't love her. He didn't want to rebuild their marriage. He wanted $338 million, and he was willing to endure 2 years of discomfort to get it. "When should I move back in?" James asked. "Tomorrow," Margaret said. "Pack light. Most of your things aren't welcome anymore." She hung up before he could respond. James moved back into the penthouse the next day with a single suitcase. Margaret had spent the morning redecorating. She'd removed every wedding photo, every gift he'd given her, every piece of furniture he particularly loved. His favorite leather chair was gone. His collection of vintage whiskey bottles had been donated. The artwork he'd chosen for the living room had been replaced. His new bedroom was the smallest in the penthouse, barely larger than a closet. She'd furnished it with a twin bed, a small dresser, and nothing else. No TV, no comfortable reading chair, no amenities. Just 4 walls and a door that locked from the outside. "This is where I'll be sleeping?" James asked, standing in the doorway and staring at the Spartan room. "This is where you'll be existing," Margaret corrected. "You'll earn back my trust inch by inch, James. And it starts here." That first night, she heard him try her bedroom door at 2 in the morning. It didn't budge. She'd installed a deadbolt earlier that day. "Margaret!" His voice was soft, cajoling. "Come on, baby. We're married. We should at least sleep in the same room." "I said separate bedrooms," she called back without getting up. "Try that again and you'll be sleeping in a hotel." She didn't hear him try again. The next morning, Margaret woke James at 5 a.m. "Get up. You work for me now and I start early." She drove them to Chun Industries in her new Bentley while James sat in the passenger seat, bleary-eyed and confused. She walked him through the building's main entrance, past the executive elevators, past the mid-level office floors, all the way down to the basement level where the filing rooms and storage areas were located. "This is your office," she said, opening a door to reveal a windowless room barely large enough for a desk and chair. "You're joking. Your title is Special Assistant to the CEO. Your job is to file, organize, run errands, schedule meetings, and do whatever else I need done. You wanted to work for Chun Industries, James. Welcome aboard." His face went through a remarkable series of expressions. Shock, anger, humiliation, and finally, resignation. He was realizing, perhaps for the first time, exactly what he'd agreed to. Over the next 6 months, Margaret systematically destroyed every aspect of James's life that had made him feel successful and important. She had him doing menial tasks, filing paperwork, getting coffee, scheduling conference rooms. His former colleagues from the real estate world would sometimes visit Chun Industries for meetings, and they'd see James carrying boxes of documents or fetching lunch orders. The whispers started immediately. She gave an interview to a major business magazine about taking over Chun Industries. When the journalist asked about her husband, Margaret had smiled sweetly and said, "James is learning the family business from the ground up. I believe everyone should start at the bottom. Don't you?" The photograph that ran with the article showed Margaret in her corner office, powerful and confident. In the background, barely visible, was James carrying a stack of file boxes. She took complete control of their finances. James got a $500 weekly allowance. His credit cards were canceled. His car, which had been registered in her name, was repossessed. He drove the oldest sedan in the company fleet, a beat-up Toyota with 200,000 miles on it. When he asked for money to buy new shoes, she told him to submit an expense report with justification. He did. She denied it, citing company policy about personal expenses. She hosted dinner parties at the penthouse and didn't invite him. When her guests asked where her husband was, she'd say sweetly, "Oh, James is working late. He has so much to learn about the business." His friends stopped calling. His mother called Margaret in tears, asking what she was doing to her son. Margaret's response was calm and collected. "I'm giving him a chance to prove himself. Isn't that what you always wanted?" The marriage counseling sessions were particularly brutal. The therapist, Dr. Sarah Winters, was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who saw through James's attempts to play the repentant husband immediately. "What have you done to rebuild trust?" Dr. Winters asked during their 5th session. James launched into a prepared speech about all his sacrifices, how he'd given up his career, how he was trying so hard to be better. Margaret waited until he was finished, then said quietly, "And what did you sacrifice when you were sleeping with your mistress for 18 months? James broke down crying. It was the first real emotion Margaret had seen from him in months, and she felt nothing. No satisfaction, no pity, no remorse. Just cold, empty nothing. Meanwhile, Vanessa was falling apart. Margaret had made sure of it. She'd had her lawyers ensure that every child support payment was a matter of public record. She'd accidentally leaked to a few key people that James had a child with another woman. The story spread like wildfire through their social circle. Tabloids picked it up. "Billionaire heiress stands by cheating husband." The articles painted Margaret as a saint and James as a pathetic social climber. Vanessa came off as an unstable homewrecker. Margaret played her role perfectly in public, the forgiving wife standing by her man. Privately, she made sure James understood exactly how much contempt she had for him. 6 months into this new arrangement, James had lost 20 pounds. He looked haggard, exhausted, defeated. He worked 80-hour weeks doing work that was beneath him, lived in a room smaller than his old closet, and endured constant social humiliation. And he had 18 months left to go. But then something happened that Margaret hadn't anticipated. Something that changed everything. Vanessa showed up at her office. Security called first. "Ma'am, there's a Vanessa Blake here demanding to see you." "Send her up," Margaret said, curious despite herself. Vanessa looked terrible. She'd lost the polished appearance from the will reading. Her clothes were cheap, her hair needed washing, and there were dark circles under her eyes. "I know what you're doing," Vanessa said without preamble. "You're torturing him." "I'm saving my marriage," Margaret replied calmly. "You're destroying him for revenge." "He destroyed our marriage. I'm just prolonging the consequences." Vanessa's hands were shaking. "What if I told you I have proof that the baby isn't his?" Time seemed to stop. Margaret stared at the other woman, trying to read whether this was a desperate lie or a terrible truth. "The baby isn't James's?" Margaret repeated slowly. Vanessa's face crumpled. "I got pregnant on purpose. I wanted to trap someone into staying with me, into taking care of me. James was so successful, so confident. I thought he'd leave you and we'd be together. But he's not actually the father. My ex-boyfriend is." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I need money to disappear," Vanessa said flatly. "Give me $2 million. I'll take the baby and go away. You can have James back. You can torture him or forgive him or do whatever you want with him. I don't care anymore." Margaret ordered a court-mandated paternity test. The results came back a week later. James was not the biological father of Vanessa's son. When Margaret showed him the results, James collapsed. He literally sank to the floor of his small bedroom, the paper shaking in his hands, and wept like a child. "I gave up everything," he sobbed. "Everything. For a baby that isn't even mine. My career, my reputation, my dignity. All of it for a lie." Margaret watched his breakdown and felt something crack inside her. Not sympathy exactly, but something close to it. For 6 months, she'd been so focused on revenge that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be human. She'd become calculating, cold, manipulative. She'd become everything she'd once despised. That night, she stood alone in her corner office, looking at a photograph of her grandfather. She remembered his last words, "Don't let bitterness consume you like it consumed me." William had died wealthy but alone. He'd driven away every person who'd ever cared about him with his suspicion and paranoia. He'd tested everyone, manipulated everyone, controlled everyone. And in the end, he'd had nothing but money. Was that who Margaret wanted to become? Rebecca visited that weekend and found Margaret sitting on her bedroom floor, surrounded by wedding albums. "You've won," Rebecca said gently. "He's broken. The 2 years is almost up. What are you waiting for?" "I don't know anymore," Margaret admitted. "I thought revenge would feel good. I thought making him suffer would heal something in me. But all I feel is empty." 3 days later, James came to her office. He didn't knock, just walked in and stood in front of her desk. For the first time in months, he looked her directly in the eye. "I want a divorce," he said. "You have 11 months left," Margaret replied automatically. "Then you get nothing." "I don't care anymore." James's voice was flat, dead. "I'd rather have my dignity than your money." He pulled his wedding ring off his finger and placed it on her desk. The small gold band rolled in a circle before falling flat with a soft click. "I was a terrible husband," James continued. "I cheated on you. I lied to you. I married you for the wrong reasons, stayed with you for the wrong reasons. I'm a bad person, Margaret. I know that now. But you—" He paused, his eyes meeting hers with something that looked almost like pity. "You've become a monster." He walked out, leaving the ring on her desk. Margaret sat alone in her office as the sun set over the city. Her empire spread out below her, $847 million under her control, 2,000 employees depending on her decisions, the whole world at her fingertips. And she'd never felt more alone in her life. She picked up James's wedding ring, feeling its weight in her palm. She'd spent 6 months destroying him, breaking him down piece by piece. And for what? To prove that she could? To make herself feel better about being betrayed? Her grandfather had given her a weapon in that will, but he'd also given her a choice. She could use that weapon to destroy her enemy, or she could choose to be better than her pain. 3 days later, Margaret had James served with divorce papers. But these weren't the papers he expected. She was giving him 25% of the estate, $211 million. Her lawyers thought she'd lost her mind. The board members of Chun Industries called emergency meetings. Robert, her grandfather's lawyer, looked at her with something like disappointment. But Margaret didn't care. She'd made her choice. She met James one final time at a coffee shop, neutral territory. He looked confused, wary. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because I realized I was punishing you to avoid feeling my own pain," Margaret said. "My grandfather died. My marriage ended. And instead of grieving properly, instead of dealing with my emotions like a healthy person, I chose revenge. I turned into someone I don't recognize." "I don't deserve your generosity," James said, and for once he sounded genuine. "No, you don't," Margaret agreed. "But I deserve to move forward without hatred consuming me. I deserve to be better than my worst moment. And you deserve a chance to figure out who you want to be without my shadow over you." James started to cry. Really cry. Not the manipulative tears she'd seen from him before, but genuine grief. "I'm sorry. God, Margaret. I'm so sorry for all of it." "I know," she said quietly. "And I forgive you. Not for you, James. For me." 1 year after that conversation, Margaret Chun stood on the balcony of her office building, looking out at the city she'd built her empire in. Chun Industries was worth $1.2 billion now. She transformed it from a traditional manufacturing company into a diversified technology and healthcare leader. She was dating someone new, a fellow architect named David who made her laugh and didn't care about her money. She'd established the Chun Foundation for Family Counseling, helping couples in crisis get the support they needed before betrayal destroyed them. And James? He'd used his settlement to start a youth mentorship program, working with at-risk teenagers. He'd been in therapy for months, genuinely trying to become a better person. Margaret had learned something important in that terrible year. The greatest revenge isn't destroying your enemy. It's refusing to let them destroy you. It's choosing to be better than your pain, stronger than your bitterness, bigger than your desire for vengeance. At the will reading, James had chosen money over love. But Margaret had chosen something far more valuable. She'd chosen herself, her peace, her humanity. And that, in the end, was worth more than $847 million. But peace, Margaret would discover, was not something you achieved once and kept forever. It was something you fought for every single day. 2 years after the divorce, Margaret was reviewing quarterly reports in her office when her assistant buzzed through on the intercom. "Ms. Chun, there's a Detective Morrison here to see you. He says it's urgent and concerns your ex-husband." Margaret's stomach dropped. She'd heard nothing from James in over a year, not since she'd seen a newspaper article about his mentorship program winning a community service award. She'd felt genuinely happy for him then, hopeful that he was truly changing. "Send him in," she said, setting down her pen and straightening her jacket. Detective Morrison was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with tired eyes and a rumpled suit. He carried himself with the weary authority of someone who'd seen too much of humanity's dark side. "Miss Chun, thank you for seeing me," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I'll get straight to the point. We're investigating James Peterson for fraud and embezzlement. It appears he's been running a Ponzi scheme through his youth mentorship program." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "That's impossible. James used his settlement to help at-risk teenagers. I've read articles about the program. It's been successful." "On paper, yes," Detective Morrison said, pulling out a tablet and sliding it across the desk. "But we've discovered that most of the success stories were fabricated. The teenagers in the promotional materials were paid actors. The donations that supposedly came from corporations were actually recycled through shell companies James controlled. He's been taking money from wealthy donors, promising them tax benefits and feel-good stories, and pocketing most of it. Margaret scrolled through the evidence on the tablet, her hands trembling slightly. Bank transfers, falsified documents, testimonials from teenagers who didn't exist. It was all there, meticulously documented. "How much?" she asked quietly. "We estimate he's stolen approximately $43 million over the past 18 months. And Ms. Chun, there's something else you need to know. Vanessa Blake is involved. She's been helping him run the scheme." Margaret looked up sharply. "Vanessa? I paid her $2 million to disappear." "She did disappear. She moved to Seattle, changed her name, laid low for about 8 months. Then she reconnected with James. According to our investigation, she approached him with the Ponzi scheme idea. Her ex-boyfriend, the actual father of her child, is a white-collar criminal. He's currently serving time for securities fraud. We believe Vanessa learned the scheme from him and recruited James to be the front man." Margaret set the tablet down carefully, trying to process what she was hearing. She'd given James $211 million. She'd forgiven him. She genuinely believed he was trying to become a better person. And he'd used that second chance to become a more sophisticated criminal. "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret asked. "I'm not involved in his business." "Because several of the donors are your business associates," Detective Morrison said. "People who invested in James's program because they trusted your judgment. When this goes public, and it will go public very soon, your name will be connected to it. We wanted to give you advance warning." After the detective left, Margaret sat alone in her office as afternoon turned to evening. She thought about the choice she'd made 2 years ago, to give James money and forgiveness instead of destroying him. Had she been naive? Foolish? Had her grandfather been right all along that people like James never really changed? Rebecca came by that evening, let in by the security guard who knew she had standing permission to visit any time. She found Margaret standing at the window, looking out at the city lights. "You heard," Rebecca said. "It wasn't a question." "The detective left 3 hours ago," Margaret replied without turning around. "I've been standing here trying to figure out if I'm angry or just sad." "You have every right to be furious. You gave him a second chance, Margaret. You gave him $200 million and your forgiveness, and he used it to hurt more people." "I know." Margaret's voice was steady, but Rebecca could hear the pain underneath. "But if I'd destroyed him 2 years ago like I'd planned, would it have made any difference? He'd still be the same person. He'd still be willing to lie and cheat and steal to get what he wants. The only difference is I'd be someone I couldn't stand to look at in the mirror." "So what are you going to do now?" Margaret finally turned from the window. "I'm going to protect the people he's hurt. The donors, the real teenagers who thought they were getting help. Everyone who believed in a program that turned out to be a lie." Over the next 48 hours, Margaret worked with her legal team to create a compensation fund for James's victims. She used her own money, $50 million from her personal accounts, to reimburse the donors who'd been defrauded. She established a real mentorship program, properly structured and audited, to actually help the at-risk youth that James had pretended to serve. The news broke on a Wednesday morning. "Philanthropist exposed as fraud mastermind," read the headline in the financial section. Margaret's name appeared in the third paragraph, identified as James's ex-wife and, in some poorly researched articles, as a possible accomplice. Her phone rang constantly, reporters wanting comments, business associates expressing concern, board members asking if this would affect Chun Industries' reputation. Margaret handled it all with grace and transparency. She gave a single interview to the most reputable business journalist she knew, explaining exactly what had happened, what she'd known and when, and what she was doing to make things right. "Do you regret giving your ex-husband a second chance?" the journalist asked. Margaret had thought carefully about her answer. "No. I regret that he abused that second chance. But I don't regret being the kind of person who believes in redemption and second chances. If I let his actions turn me bitter and cynical, then he's won. And I refuse to let that happen." The interview went viral. Public opinion, which had initially been suspicious of Margaret's involvement, swung firmly in her support. People admired her grace under pressure, her willingness to compensate victims from her own pocket, her refusal to let betrayal make her cruel. James and Vanessa were arrested 3 days after the story broke. They'd been planning to flee to a country without an extradition treaty, but the FBI had been monitoring their movements. They were caught at a private airfield with forged passports and $8 million in cash. Margaret watched the perp walk on the news with Rebecca beside her. James looked older, harder, nothing like the charming man she'd married or even the broken man she'd divorced. Vanessa walked beside him with her head down, and Margaret felt nothing but pity for both of them. "They're saying 20 to 30 years, Rebecca said quietly. "Federal prison, no parole." "I know." Margaret picked up the remote and turned off the television. "I hope they use that time to actually change. I genuinely hope they become better people, even though I'll never know if they do." "You're a better person than I am," Rebecca said. "I'd want them to suffer." "They will suffer," Margaret replied. "Prison is suffering. Losing your freedom, your dignity, your future, that's all suffering. But hoping they suffer more, hoping they're miserable every single day, that just makes me suffer too." I learned that lesson already. The trial was scheduled for 6 months later. Margaret was called as a witness, asked to testify about the divorce settlement and what James had told her about his plans for the money. She told the truth simply and clearly. Yes, James had said he wanted to help troubled youth. No, she'd had no reason to suspect he was planning fraud. Yes, looking back, there had been red flags she'd missed because she'd wanted to believe in his redemption. The prosecutor tried to make her sound naive. The defense attorney tried to make her sound vindictive. But Margaret remained calm and consistent, and by the end of her testimony, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that she was simply a woman who'd tried to do the right thing and been betrayed for it. James took the stand in his own defense. It was a mistake, Margaret's lawyer friends told her later. Defendants almost never testify, and James proved why. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he said, his voice breaking with what seemed like genuine emotion. "After my divorce, I was lost. I destroyed my marriage, ruined my reputation, lost my career. When Vanessa came to me with the idea for the mentorship program, it seemed like a way to actually do something good, to make amends." "And when did it become a fraud?" the prosecutor asked. James hesitated. "It started small. A few expenses that weren't quite accurate. A success story that was exaggerated. But the donors loved it. They wanted to hear about lives being changed, and we gave them what they wanted. Before I knew it, we were creating fake teenagers, fabricating stories, hiding money. It spiraled out of control." "Did you think about stopping?" Another hesitation. "Yes, many times. But by then, we'd taken so much money. We couldn't just give it back. We would have been caught. So we kept going, kept lying, kept stealing. And I told myself it was okay because some real good was being done. We did help a few actual teenagers, gave out some real scholarships. I told myself that made it okay." "Did it make it okay?" James looked directly at Margaret, who was sitting in the gallery. Their eyes met for the first time in over a year. "No," he said quietly. "Nothing makes it okay. I was given a second chance, more than I deserved, and I threw it away. I'm not a good person. I've never been a good person, and I don't think I know how to become one." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. James was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Vanessa received 18 years for her role as an accomplice. Margaret didn't attend the sentencing. She'd already said goodbye to that chapter of her life. Instead, she spent that day at the Chun Foundation, meeting with a young couple who were struggling with trust issues after an affair. She listened to their pain, watched them navigate their anger and hurt, and helped them understand that they had a choice. They could let the betrayal destroy them, or they could choose to heal. "How do you know if you're making the right choice?" the wife asked, tears streaming down her face. "How do you know if you should stay or go?" Margaret thought about her own journey. The rage, the revenge, the forgiveness, the betrayal that came after the forgiveness. She thought about her grandfather's will, designed to test her character. She thought about James, rotting in prison for crimes he'd committed even after being given a second chance. "You don't know," Margaret said honestly. "You make the best choice you can with the information you have, and you live with the consequences. But I can tell you this, don't make your choice based on what will hurt your partner most. Make it based on what will help you become the person you want to be. The woman nodded, wiping her eyes. Her husband reached for her hand, and she let him take it. Margaret watched them leave together, uncertain of their future but at least willing to try, and felt something warm bloom in her chest. Purpose, meaning, the knowledge that her pain could be transformed into something that helped others. That night, she stood on her penthouse balcony, looking out at the city she'd conquered and the empire she'd built. Chun Industries was thriving. The foundation was helping hundreds of couples and families. She had real friends, genuine relationships built on mutual respect rather than money or status. Her phone buzzed. A text from David, the architect she'd been dating for over a year now. Still on for dinner tomorrow? I want to talk to you about something important. Margaret smiled. She knew what he wanted to talk about. He'd been hinting at it for weeks, getting more serious about their future together. A small velvet box had been poorly hidden in his apartment the last time she'd visited. A year ago, the thought of remarrying would have terrified her. But David wasn't James. He'd known her before the inheritance, had seen her at her worst and her best, and loved her anyway. He'd signed a prenup without being asked, told her he'd be happy living in a studio apartment as long as they were together. Most importantly, he'd said something last month that had stayed with her. You've been through hell, Margaret. You've been betrayed and hurt, and you've made mistakes trying to cope with that pain. But you came through it as someone who still believes in goodness. That's what I love about you. Not your money, not your success, but your refusal to let cruelty make you cruel. Margaret texted back, looking forward to it. And yes, the answer is yes. She didn't need to play games. Didn't need to test him or manipulate him or protect herself with elaborate conditions. She'd learned the hard way that you couldn't control other people. You could only control yourself, your choices, your responses to whatever life threw at you. 3 months later, Margaret married David in a small ceremony with 50 guests. No elaborate prenup beyond the standard asset protection. No conditions about separate bedrooms or supervised work. Just two people who'd chosen each other freely, clearly, with full knowledge of each other's flaws and past mistakes. Rebecca was her maid of honor. During the reception, she pulled Margaret aside. Are you sure about this? After everything with James? I'm sure, Margaret said, watching David laugh with her business colleagues, completely comfortable in a world that would have intimidated the old James. James taught me what I don't want. David showed me what I do want. I'm not going to let one bad choice prevent me from making a good one. What if you're wrong again? Margaret smiled. Then I'll deal with it. But this time, I'll deal with it as someone who knows who she is and what she's worth. I'm not that naive woman who married James. I'm not the vengeful person who tortured him for 6 months. I'm someone who's made mistakes and learned from them. And that's enough. Years passed. Chun Industries continued to grow. The foundation expanded to 6 cities. Margaret and David had 2 children, a daughter named Lily and a son named William, after her grandfather. She thought about James sometimes, wondered if he was actually rehabilitating in prison or just counting down the days until release. She wondered if he'd learned anything, changed at all, or if he was still the same opportunist she'd divorced. But mostly, she didn't think about him at all. On the 10th anniversary of her grandfather's death, Margaret visited his grave with her children. Lily was 6, William was 4. They placed flowers on the headstone while Margaret told them stories about their great-grandfather. Was he a good man? Lily asked. Margaret thought about the question carefully. He was a complicated man. He was smart and successful, and he loved me very much. But he was also suspicious and controlling. He let fear make him lonely. Are you like him? William asked. I try to take the good parts and leave the bad parts, Margaret said. He taught me to be strong and smart, but I learned on my own how to be kind and forgiving. Even to bad people? Lily asked. Especially to bad people, Margaret replied, because refusing to forgive them doesn't hurt them. It hurts you. Carrying around anger and bitterness is like carrying around heavy rocks. Eventually, you have to put them down, or they'll crush you. On the drive home, David took her hand. "Do you ever regret how everything turned out? The will, the divorce, the money?" Margaret looked at her children in the back seat, at the man beside her who loved her for who she actually was, at the life she'd built from the ashes of her grandfather's death and her first marriage's betrayal. "No," she said. "I regret that people got hurt. I regret that James and Vanessa made choices that destroyed their lives. I regret that I wasted 6 months being someone I didn't recognize. But I don't regret where I ended up. Even though you could have kept all the money if you'd been ruthless?" Margaret laughed. "I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, David. What I have that's actually valuable is peace, self-respect, the knowledge that when I was tested, when I had all the power and every reason to be cruel, I chose mercy instead. That's worth more than any inheritance." That night, after the children were in bed, Margaret stood in her study, looking at the framed copy of her grandfather's will that hung on the wall. She'd had it professionally mounted years ago, a reminder of the moment that had changed everything. She understood now what her grandfather had really given her. Not money, though there was plenty of that. Not a company, though Chun Industries was her pride and joy. He'd given her a choice. He'd put her in a position where she could become bitter and cruel, where she had every reason and every opportunity to destroy another person. And he'd trusted that she would choose differently, that she would be better than her pain, stronger than her anger, more compassionate than he'd ever been. "Thank you, Gong Gong," she whispered to the frame. "I finally understand." At the will reading, James had arrived holding another woman's baby, and he'd chosen money over dignity. Margaret had been faced with the same choice, again and again. Money or mercy, power or peace, revenge or redemption. And every time, eventually, she'd chosen mercy. That was her grandfather's real legacy. Not the $847 million, but the understanding that how you treat people when you have all the power defines who you really are. Margaret Chun had been tested by betrayal, tempted by revenge, and given every opportunity to become hard and cruel. Instead, she'd chosen to remain human. And in the end, that choice had given her everything that actually mattered. Love, peace, purpose, and the ability to sleep soundly at night, knowing she'd done her best to be good in a world that often rewarded being ruthless. The money was nice, but it was never the point. The point was who she'd become despite everything that had tried to break her. And that person, Margaret thought as she turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, was someone her grandfather would have been proud of. Someone she was proud of. Someone worth being.